Canada has a particular way of making certain women disappear, not through cruelty alone, but through the slow, polite accumulation of small dismissals, a sigh held back, a name forgotten, a seat never offered. Moira Trask had learned this lesson so thoroughly by 29 that she had become its most devoted practitioner. She dressed for invisibility, oversized oatmeal-colored cardigans that swallowed her plus-sized frame, thick-rimmed glasses that sat heavy on her nose, dark hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked almost accidental. She worked in the document analysis department of Mace Meridian Logistics, a mid-sized shipping firm occupying the 4th and 5th floors of a granite building on Halifax's waterfront. To the outside world, Mace Meridian moved freight along the Atlantic corridor. To the people who mattered, the people who never visited the 4th floor, it served a different function entirely. Moira didn't know the full shape of that other function. She knew enough, in the way that smart people who need their jobs know exactly how much not to know. She catalogued shipping manifests, cross-referenced cargo declarations with customs filings, and did her work with a precision that nobody above her pay grade ever acknowledged. Her desk was in the eastern corner of the document room, beside a window that looked out at the harbor. She had been there 4 years. She had been promoted once by accident when her direct supervisor left without notice. On the morning everything changed, she was reviewing a batch of freight manifests from the previous quarter when she found it. The discrepancy was buried, 3 layers of subcontractor invoicing, a shell-numbered company registered in Riverview, New Brunswick, and a rounding error that anyone else would have dismissed as a clerical glitch. Moira stared at it for 4 full minutes. The numbers told a story. Someone at Mace Meridian was siphoning freight insurance payouts through a dummy intermediary, not a great deal at a time, never enough to trigger automatic flags. But over 18 months, the accumulated total was pushing $600,000. She was still staring at the printout when Heather Sloan dropped a stack of transfer orders on top of it. "Those need to be cross-matched before end of day," Heather said without looking at her, already walking away. Heather was a senior analyst with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. She had bleached highlights and a habit of seeing Moira's supervisor on emails that didn't require it. "Try not to spill your coffee on them. We know how you are." Moira said nothing. She slid the manifests aside, tucked the anomalous printout into a folder, and pulled Heather's transfer orders toward her. Numbers made sense to Moira in a way that people never quite had. Numbers didn't leave pauses before saying her name, or find reasons to exclude her from the Friday lunches on Barrington Street. The office changed at 10:30. It happened the way weather changes on the Atlantic, suddenly without warning, as if the air pressure itself had decided to shift. Keyboards went quiet. A phone rang twice and wasn't answered. Moira looked up from her desk. Through the glass panel of the document room, she could see the open-plan office beyond had gone entirely still. Every person at every desk had found somewhere else to look. Kieran Mace walked through the space like a man who had never once wondered whether he belonged somewhere. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had nothing left to prove. He wore a charcoal suit with a white shirt, open at the collar, no tie. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw, pale against tanned skin. His eyes, even from a distance, were pale grey, the color of the harbor on an overcast day, and they moved across the office with the calm, relentless attention of someone cataloguing everything they saw. Beside him walked his right-hand man, a heavy-set Haligonian named Stavros Anther, who radiated the specific kind of menace that comes from long experience in confined spaces. Behind them, 2 men in dark coats kept their hands visible and their expressions neutral. Kieran Mace owned Mace Meridian Logistics in the same way he owned approximately a third of the Atlantic shipping corridor. Thoroughly, quietly, and without particular sentiment. He moved toward the executive boardroom at the end of the hall. The doors closed. Franklin Dodd, Moira's division manager, materialized outside the document room 30 seconds later. His face had gone the color of old porridge. He opened the door and looked at Moira with the expression of a man who has decided to throw something overboard in order to stay afloat. "Trask," he said, "I need you to take the Harbor Gate files into the boardroom, the Q4 summary package, the physical copies now." Moira looked at him. "I'm in the middle of Heather's transfer orders." "Leave them. Take the Harbor Gate files." "I'm a document analyst, Franklin. I don't present to senior management." "You do today," he exhaled through his nose. "Just walk them in, set them on the table, and walk out. Simple." Moira understood. She understood completely. She looked down at her cardigan, at the shapeless fabric she had put on that morning for exactly this purpose, to make herself easy to overlook. Franklin had chosen her because she was the safe option. He was betting that a man like Kieran Mace would barely register her presence. She was the perfect delivery. Her mother's medication costs had gone up again last month. Her older brother was 2 payments behind on his mortgage and had asked her carefully, twice, if she could help. She could not lose this job. Moira stood up, gathered the Harbor Gate files, and walked down the hall. The boardroom doors were heavy. She pushed one open with her shoulder and stepped inside. The room was large, dominated by a long table of pale ash wood and floor-to-ceiling windows looking directly onto the harbor. The grey water caught the October light and threw it back in fragments. It was objectively a beautiful view, and Moira had never once been inside this room to see it. Kieran Mace sat at the far end of the table. He wasn't reviewing documents or looking at his phone. He was simply sitting, watching the door, with the focused patience of a man accustomed to waiting for things that were worth waiting for. Stavros stood to his left. The 2 men in dark coats had taken up positions near the windows. Moira kept her eyes on the table surface. She walked to the midpoint, set the files down with careful alignment, and said, "The Harbor Gate Q4 summary, Mr. Mace," in a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to expect. She turned to leave. "Stop." The word was quiet. It was also completely unignorable, in the way that very still water is unignorable, because its stillness tells you something is underneath. Moira stopped. "Turn around." She did. She kept her gaze on the middle distance, on the space between his shoulder and the window behind him. Kieran Mace leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, and studied her for a moment. The ill-fitting cardigan, the heavy glasses, the way she was standing with her chin tucked and her shoulders rounded, a posture so practiced it had become structural. He noticed the posture specifically, because it didn't match the way she moved. She had crossed 20 feet of unfamiliar room carrying a stack of files without making a sound, without wavering, with a particular quality of controlled stillness that the people he employed at her pay grade almost never had. "What's your name?" he asked. "Moira Trask, document analysis." "How long have you worked here, Moira?" 4 years. "And who decided to send you in with these files instead of Franklin Dodd himself?" She could feel the room's attention settle onto her. Stavros had shifted his weight. One of the men near the windows had turned his head a fraction. Moira looked at Kieran Mace directly for the first time. "Franklin did," she said, "because he believed that you wouldn't pay any particular attention to me. He thought I was the safest option to send." A silence followed that had texture to it. Stavros cleared his throat softly and looked at the ceiling. Kieran Mace did not look away from her. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, like a scale adjusting to a weight it hadn't anticipated. "That's an honest answer," he said. "I thought lying to you seemed inadvisable." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "Come and sit down." She did not move immediately. "Moira," he said, as though he had been using her name for years. "Sit down." She sat. He looked at the files she had set on the table, then back at her. "You've been in document analysis for 4 years. What do you do, specifically? I cross-reference shipping manifests against customs declarations. I reconcile discrepancies in cargo routing and flag anomalies for internal review. And have you flagged anything recently? There it was. Moira had been holding a folded printout in the same cardigan pocket since that morning. She was not entirely certain why she had brought it with her into this room, but some part of her had understood, somewhere between standing up from her desk and walking down this corridor, that she was stepping into something, and she had brought the one thing that might matter. She reached into her pocket and set the printout on the table. Subcontractor invoicing chain through a numbered company registered in Riverview, New Brunswick, she said, her voice clear and even. The insurance recovery payouts on 3 separate cargo claims have been inflated, and the difference routed to an external account. 18 months of activity, approximately $600,000. The rounding is designed to fall beneath automated audit thresholds, but the pattern is consistent across all 3 claims. Silence. Stavros straightened from the wall. Kieran Mace reached forward and picked up the printout. He read it without hurry. His expression did not change in any obvious way, but the quality of his stillness deepened, like a river just before it narrows. He set the paper down and looked at Moira. Whose account? I don't know yet. The numbered company registration is publicly accessible. I'd need approximately 30 minutes with the corporate filings database to trace it to a named individual. He studied her for a long moment. Do you understand what this building is, Moira? I understand what the building tells people it is. And the rest. I know enough to understand that whoever is skimming those payouts is taking from someone who would consider that a very serious problem. Kieran Mace nodded once slowly, then he looked at Stavros. Get Franklin. She didn't stay for whatever happened to Franklin Dodd. She was given a workspace 2 floors up and 30 minutes with the corporate filings database, and in 22 minutes she traced the numbered company to a senior logistics coordinator named Ralston Cabe, who had been with Mace Meridian for 11 years and had, until that morning, been considered entirely reliable. Within 48 hours, Moira Trask's life became something she did not entirely recognize. She was given an office on the 5th floor, not a workstation, an actual office, with a door and a window and a desk that was not government surplus grey. Kieran placed the entire document and financial analysis operation under her oversight. His lieutenants received this news with expressions ranging from bafflement to carefully concealed irritation, but none of them said anything in Kieran's presence, because they had not survived in his proximity by saying unwise things. The fear did not go away. It was still there every morning when the elevator opened onto the 5th floor, but something else arrived alongside it, a sensation Moira had no reliable name for, because she had never felt it before. The sensation of her actual mind being used for its actual capacity. She still wore the cardigans. She still pulled her hair back. On her 4th day on the 5th floor, Kieran walked into her office in the early afternoon and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of concern, a focused, assessing quality, like someone checking a structure for invisible fractures. "You're hiding again," he said. She looked up from the screen. "I'm working." "You're dressed to disappear." He said it without judgment, as a simple observation. "And the woman who traced $600,000 in fraud in 22 minutes doesn't get to disappear anymore." Before she could respond, he had picked up his phone and made a single call. He said 3 sentences in a low voice and hung up. An hour later, a woman named Isadora arrived with 2 assistants and a rolling rack of garments. Isadora styled people whose names appeared in the Halifax Chronicle's annual power lists. She had precise dark eyes and the manner of someone who had never once second-guessed a decision in a fitting room. Moira stared at the rack. "I don't," she began. "You don't have to become someone else," Kieran said from the doorway. That's not what this is. Isadora proved him right. She took no interest in what Moira weighed, or how she compared to any external measure. She was interested, with fierce professional absorption, in cut and fabric and line. She brought structured blazers in deep winter colors that followed the actual curve of Moira's waist, instead of hiding from it. She brought wrap dresses in heavy crepe that moved well and sat properly across wide hips and full shoulders. She brought trousers tailored for an actual body rather than a theoretical one. She replaced the thick-framed glasses with a narrower, tortoise-shell pair that sat better on Moira's face and stopped obscuring the dark amber of her eyes. She let Moira's hair down. When Moira finally turned to look at herself in the full-length mirror that Isadora's assistant had propped against the office wall, she went very still. She was not smaller. Her body hadn't changed in the hour she had spent in the care of a stranger with a tape measure and strong opinions, but she looked present. She looked like someone who occupied her own outline deliberately. The charcoal blazer and the dark wine dress beneath it made her look like someone who made decisions that mattered. Because she was, in fact, someone who made decisions that mattered, and the clothes had simply stopped arguing with that reality. Kieran stepped into the doorway. He had been working in the adjacent room, and he stopped when he saw her. A full stop, not a pause, and his pale grey eyes moved over her with a directness that she had no idea how to receive. "That," he said quietly, "is the woman I hired." She looked away, old reflex. "Don't," he said. She looked back. The first real test came at the end of the following week, at a dinner meeting in a private room at a waterfront hotel. The other party was Dermot Wraith, who ran the freight brokerage network out of St. John, and had been pressing Kieran for months over a revenue dispute on a transatlantic routing contract. Dermot had been claiming that his network's margins had collapsed due to Mace Meridian's routing decisions, and he wanted a restructured agreement, one considerably in his favor. Moira arrived on Kieran's arm. The reaction from Dermot Wraith's side of the table was immediate and unflattering. A scan, a blink, a rapid reassessment downward. She was accustomed to that look. She had stopped allowing it to rearrange her expression. Dermot placed his documentation on the table with the confidence of a man who believed his numbers were unassailable. He walked through his loss projections with the manner of someone laying out an obvious conclusion. Moira waited until he finished. Then she reached across the table and pulled the nearest document toward her. She read in silence for 90 seconds. "Your fuel surcharge calculations," she said, "are using the 2022 rate schedule." She turned 2 pages. "Your depreciation claims on the St. John depot are filed under a class that hasn't applied to freight brokerage operations since the federal reclassification in January. And this column." She turned the document and set it in front of Dermot. "Lists maintenance costs for 3 vehicles that your own company's insurance filings reported as written off 18 months ago." Dermot Wraith's confidence did not collapse immediately. It corroded, which was worse. "You owe Mr. Mace's network approximately $240,000 in underpaid routing fees," Moira continued, in the same measured tone she used when explaining a discrepancy to a junior analyst. "Not the other way around. I'm happy to walk through the full calculation, if that would help." Dermot looked at Kieran. Kieran was leaning back in his chair with the stillness he used when he was experiencing something close to satisfaction. "She's thorough," Dermot said, with the thin smile of a man who was recalibrating everything. "She's correct," Kieran said. Power, Moira discovered, arrives with its own gravity, and gravity attracts things other than what you want. 3 weeks after the meeting with Dermot Wraith, she was working late in her 5th-floor office, reviewing the offshore holding accounts attached to Mace Meridian's legitimate real estate portfolio. The building was quiet. The harbor lights moved on the water outside her window. She found it in a subsidiary trust account. Micro-transactions, consistent spacing. each one just beneath the threshold that would flag automatically. She ran the pattern against the previous 22 months, and then sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Ralston Cabe had already been dealt with. This was someone else, someone with considerably deeper access. She was still looking at the numbers when Kieran came through the door, jacket off, having just come from something at the docks. He took one look at her face and stopped. What is it? She turned the monitor to face him. He looked at the screen, his jaw tightened. The access level on this trust account, she said carefully, is restricted to senior management, and the external account receiving these transfers, the holding pattern and the jurisdictional routing, it's consistent with what I found in Dermot Wraith's documentation. The implication settled into the room like a cold front moving in off the water. Someone is feeding information to Wraith, Kieran said. And channeling funds, yes. She paused, the access logs point to Stavros Ant. She braced herself. She had spent 3 weeks learning to read Kieran Mace's particular brand of stillness, and what arrived on his face now was not what she expected. It was not rage, it was something older and quieter, the expression of a man confronting a pain he had already, somewhere, anticipated. He pulled out his phone and dialed, "Stavros, my office now." He looked at Moira after he hung up. "You're certain?" "The routing numbers are exact. I cross-checked against 3 separate databases." "Then I'm certain." He moved toward the door, then turned back. "Stay here." What happened in the next 2 hours was not something she could follow from her office. She heard voices through the wall, Kieran's low and precise, another voice rising and then going very quiet, the sound of a door, footsteps descending the interior stairs. Then nothing for 40 minutes. Then the fire alarm system cut out, the lights died. And then the sound of the east stairwell door being forced open. Moira was under the desk before she had consciously decided to move. 3 men with flashlights moved through the outer corridor. She could hear them through the wall, methodical, sweeping the rooms. She reached up without lifting her head and found the network cable running behind the desk. She traced it to the portable router she had requested for the server room's secondary terminal 2 weeks ago, after reading a facilities report that mentioned the building's backup generator had an independent uplink. She had filed that detail away without knowing why. She knew why now. She plugged in, opened the financial transfer system through the backup power, and began locking the trust accounts one by one. Every account that Stavros had access to, every external routing number she had identified that evening. She was on the 6th account when she heard the struggle in the corridor outside. There were sounds she chose not to interpret, a crash, voices cut short, silence. Then Kieran was in the doorway, a cut above his cheekbone, breathing controlled, eyes scanning the dark room until they found her beneath the desk. "Are you hurt?" His voice was level. "No, you?" He crossed the room in 4 strides and crouched down beside her. He looked at the glowing laptop screen, the locked accounts listed across it, the transfers frozen, the external routing numbers flagged and closed. He was quiet for a moment. "You locked them down," he said. "All 6 external routing accounts. He won't be able to move anything. The transfers are frozen until you authorize them manually." Kieran sat back on his heels and looked at her. In the blue glow of the laptop, in the dark and the aftermath of whatever had just happened beyond the glass partition, he looked at her with an attention that had no qualifier in it. No pity, no surprise, no hesitation, just the full, clear sight of someone who had been looking for a particular thing for a long time and had found it, and knew exactly what he was looking at. "Moira," he said. "Yes." "You just protected $32 million in the dark on a backup router while men were in the corridor. The accounts needed locking." They did. He reached out and took her hand, not a gesture of comfort but of recognition. "You are the most capable person in this building, and I mean that including myself." Dermot Wraith moved quickly once he understood that Stavros was in custody and the information pipeline had been severed. He called a meeting of the major Atlantic network operators, a gathering at a hotel conference room in Moncton, framed as neutral ground, and circulated the story that Mace Meridian was compromised from within, its internal controls shattered, and that a leadership transition was not only appropriate but overdue. Kieran arrived at that meeting with Moira beside him. The room held 11 people, none of whom were accustomed to being surprised. They were surprised. Moira wore a dress the color of a November sea, deep teal, structured at the shoulders, moving well when she walked. The tortoise-shell glasses, her hair down. She had looked at herself in the mirror that morning and not looked away. Dermot Wraith looked at her and chose the wrong tactic. "Kieran, I didn't realize this was a public meeting." "It's private," Kieran said pleasantly, pulling out the chair at the head of the table for Moira before taking the seat beside her. "That's why it's only us." Dermot spread his documentation across the table. He had prepared a thorough presentation of the Mace Meridian situation, the internal breach, the frozen accounts, what he characterized as evidence of organizational failure. Moira opened the leather folio she had brought and looked at him with the particular quality of focus she had spent her entire career hiding in a corner of the 4th floor. "Mr. Wraith," she said, and the room paid attention in the immediate involuntary way that rooms do when the person speaking has something real to say. "You've characterized the account freeze as evidence of failure. That framing is incorrect. The accounts were frozen by me from a backup terminal within 11 minutes of the breach being initiated. The funds are intact, every dollar." Dermot's expression shifted by a fraction. "What Stavros Anther's arrest does reveal," she continued, "is a 2-year financial relationship between your network and a contact inside Mace Meridian, which means that every piece of financial data your St. John operation has used to negotiate with us over the past 24 months came from a compromised source." She paused to let that settle, including the projections you presented at our last meeting, which I have since rerun using clean data. She set a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it to the center. "Your network's actual share of the transatlantic routing revenue, calculated from uncompromised figures, is approximately 40% of what you've claimed. The renegotiated terms you presented last month were built entirely on fabricated inputs that came from your own contact inside our organization." She looked at him evenly. "You've been negotiating with numbers that your own asset invented for you." Dermot Wraith stared at the paper. "We have the banking records, the communications, and the transfer logs," Moira said. "All of it. You're welcome to have your people verify the figures independently. You'll find they're accurate." The room was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Dermot reached for the paper, read it, set it down. "The terms that were in place before the false projections were introduced," Moira said. "The original agreement, before your network began manipulating the numbers. Those terms were fair to both parties. We're prepared to continue under those terms." The representative from the Charlottetown network, gray-haired, deliberate, someone who had been in that industry long enough to know when to step towards something solid, looked at Dermot and then at Moira and said simply, "I'll take those terms." 2 more voices followed, then a 4th. Dermot Wraith sat back in his chair. Whatever he had driven to Moncton to accomplish had been taken apart with careful precision and placed in front of him on a single sheet of paper. He had no performance left to give. "Fine," he said quietly. Kieran Mace had not spoken once during the negotiation. He sat to Moira's left, and at the moment Dermot conceded, he turned and looked at her with his pale grey eyes, and an expression she had come to understand was the closest he came to open feeling. When the room had mostly emptied and only the 2 of them remained at the long table, he stood and looked at her across the pale ash wood. 4 years, he said, you were in that building. She gathered her folio. 4 years. I walked through that office a dozen times. He said it like a man filing a genuine complaint against himself. "And I didn't find you until you walked into my boardroom." "Franklin sent me in because he thought you wouldn't notice me," Moira said. "He was trying to protect himself." "He did me the greatest favor of his career." Kieran crossed to where she stood at the end of the table, and he looked at her the same way he had looked at her since that first morning, completely, without reservation, without the faint overlay of surprise that most people couldn't quite hide. "In every room from here on, I find you first. Do you understand me, Moira?" Outside, the November rain was coming in off the Bay of Fundy. Inside, Moira Trask stood at the head of a table that powerful men had used to draw and redraw their maps for 20 years, in a dress the color of the Atlantic in autumn, and she felt, precisely, unmistakably, the moment when hiding stopped being her default condition. She looked at him. "I understand," she said. The woman who had made herself invisible for 29 years had simply run out of reasons to disappear.